Okay, well, here we are, back in Matthew, right?
Still.
Yep.
Still.
We've got, what, one more lesson in Matthew? Nope, two. Okay. Well, last week we were at the Passover, right? And they went out to the garden, and Jesus prayed. And what were the guys doing? What were his disciples doing while he was praying? The biggest mental battle in the history of the world, and they were asleep. So they weren't exactly Johnny on the spot, were they? And he said, "Watch and pray with me."
I don't think they understood what was getting ready to happen.
I don't think they did either.
Even if he had told them, I don't think they understood it.
He did tell them. You're right, though. They still didn't get it, right? He says, "My betrayer," right? He told them about the betrayer and what's going on, and they went out to pray, and he'd been telling them he was going to Jerusalem for what purpose? To die. But on the third day, he'd be resurrected. And for some reason, that whole concept just was so foreign to their thinking that they did not get it. Now.
Well, if you've never seen anybody resurrected.
But they have. They've seen Jesus raise people from the dead. So they didn't have quite as much excuse as those who hadn't seen it, but they had seen that happen, right? And he was saying what was going to happen, and Peter said, "Not me. I'll never leave you. I'll die with you." And Jesus told him, "Before the cock crows, you'll even deny you even know me 3 times. And then they go out there to pray, and he says, "Pray that you do not enter temptation," right? But instead of praying, they were sleeping, right? So now we get to verse 36 in chapter 26. We did remember last week, and he took the 3 aside, and like we were talking about, and apparently they all went to sleep, not just the 3, the whole bunch of them, right? Then Judas comes in verse 47, and he's arrested. And where do they take him? Where's the first place he goes?
Pilots.
No, they take him to the former high priest, Annas. Okay?
Where are you?
Well, we're running through a summation leading up to the focal point of today's lesson,
Okay.
right?
You
And
said verse 47.
47,
I'm trying to.
that's where Judas came and he was arrested, right? But when he's arrested, what did Peter do?
He cut the ear off.
He drew his sword and tried to split poor Malchus plumb in half. But all he got was his ear. And Jesus did what?
Stuck it back on.
Healed his ear and told Peter to put away the sword, right? Those who live by the sword will perish by the sword. But he also said something interesting. In verse 53, "Do you think I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels?" That would be somewhere around 72,000 angels. How many would he need to put these guys down? Now, at the most 1, because he could do it himself with just a thought, he could turn them into vapor. Right? At the arrest, not in Matthew, but in John, he said, to them, "Who do you seek?" And they said, "We seek Jesus the Nazarene." And he said, "I am he." The I am phrase, right? And what happened to the arresters? In John. It's only in John.
They fell down.
They were knocked back and down on the ground, right? Just from the statement, "I am." That's one thing you've never seen in a movie, in a crucifixion movie, for some reason. You know, that and at the scene where the Jewish people are said, "Let his blood be on our heads and on our children." Even Mel took that out of the movie to appease the Jews. Right? They didn't like that. That's what they said. God told us. Right? So if a guy says, "I am," and all of you guys get knocked down, and there could have been, because it says a cohort, could have been 200 guys there to arrest him. They didn't know how many followers he was going to have with him. Right? Wouldn't you be a little more careful about how abusive you would be at that point?
I don't think I would arrest him. Have a nice day.
Yeah. Right? But Jesus came for a purpose. It really wasn't up to them. He's there for a very specific reason, and that's what's going to happen. Right? So, he's arrested. They take him to Annas' house first, right? And then they take him to the current high priest, Caiaphas. In verse 57, led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were gathering together. So he pulls together this group of part of the Sanhedrin, right, to have this mock trial, okay? Trials are not held in the home of the high priest. There's a special court, where they all sit, I don't know what they call it. And that's where they hold trials. But there were no less than 21 Jewish laws broken by the high priests and the Jews in the trial of Jesus. Okay? And they were trying to obtain false testimony in verse 59. They couldn't find any, even though many false witnesses came forward, But later on, two came forward and said, "This man stated, 'I am able to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days.'" Did Jesus say that? But what temple was he talking about? The body. They said he meant this temple, which is known as Herod's temple, right? That's taken Herod 40 years to embellish, right? And he said you could knock it down and rebuild. Could he rebuild it in 3 days if he wanted to? Yeah. He built the entire universe in 6.
We're going to bet against him.
Yeah, I wouldn't bet against him. But that isn't what he was talking about. Now, did the high priest know that? Did they understand what he was saying? We know they did, because later they came to Pilate and said, "This man said that he was going to raise from the dead in 3 days. So we've got to put guards to make sure that nobody steals his body and says he was risen from the dead," right? They knew what he was talking about. They didn't care, right? In verse 62, and the high priest stood up and said to him, "Do you make no answer? What is this that these men are testifying against you?" But Jesus kept silent. Isaiah 53, verse 7. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God." They knew the Messiah was deity. When the Messiah came, he would be deity. He would be the Son of God. They knew that. Jesus been saying all this time that he was, right, the Son of God. Frequently called himself Son of Man, which is the term from Daniel, meaning the Messiah, which is, in other words, the same thing. Right? And Jesus said to them, "You have said it." In Mark 14:62, it's translated, "I am." What phrase really upsets the Jews? Or is there any phrase that upsets them more than "I am"? Right? Moses at the burning bush. Who do I tell them that sent me? Tell them I am sent you. Right? This is Jehovah God. And Jesus says, that's me. It's true. Right? Then he says, nevertheless, I tell you hereafter, you shall see the Messiah, the Son of Man, sitting at the right hand of power, which is a Jewish phrase for the Father, right? And coming on the clouds of heaven. Right? So Jesus saying, yes, I'm the Messiah, right? The King, the Messiah King. And the high priest tore his robes, saying, he has blasphemed. What further need do we have of witnesses? They had to have 2 witnesses in order to convict anybody, right? They couldn't find any witnesses that he had done anything, except something that was against what they wanted, right? If you're a dirty politician, you don't like the truth. And that's what you've got here, right? And the truth comes and stares you in the face, you're trying to slap it down. You get political and say, just ask the Dems. Right? And this is what they're doing. Said, you have heard the blasphemy. Right? Now, if somebody who was not the Messiah claimed to be the Messiah, would that be blasphemy? Mm-hmm. Yes. And in the Old Testament, the punishment for blasphemy is stoning. Yep. Okay? Now, in this case, when you look at the mountains of evidence that everything Jesus said had to be true, you should take pause. I watched another video about 9 minutes long of a guy who's Jewish who'd been raised and taught, don't ever read that New Testament, that Christian Bible. That's nothing but instructions on how to persecute the Jews. That's what he was told. And I don't remember why he started reading the New Testament, out of curiosity, but more than anything, maybe because he'd been told, don't do this, don't do this. I got to check it out, right? He starts reading and he says, no, wait a minute. These are Jews, written to Jews, about Jews and the Jewish Messiah, right? And over a period of time, he came to realize that Jesus was the Messiah, right? And he got saved, and later his father got saved, just from reading the New Testament. I heard a guy one time say that same thing. How in the world did our Messiah end up being their Messiah? That's what got him to start checking it out, Okay? So here they are saying, this is blasphemy. What do you think? And they answered and said, he is deserving of death. So God says, yep, I'm the Messiah. And they say, we have to kill God.
They must not have thought about that.
All they were thinking about is, he's messing up our game. He's completely messing up our game. Our money-making system, etc. He's got to go. It's that simple.
But they didn't think that they were actually killing God.
No.
I mean, surely they're not that dumb and ignorant. They're trying to stop the noise.
Well, who's the one that stood up in the trial and said, wait a minute, right? What? Let me get this straight. This was, I think, at Paul's trial, right? And one of the guys, in the Sanhedrin stood up and said, wait a minute, guys, here you are trying to, persecute these guys, right? Mm-hmm. And if this is false, it'll evaporate and blow away like dozens of others have in the past. But if this is actually a movement of God, you're going to find yourself doing battle with God. And they're like, get rid of them! Right? But they were so blind to doing their own will. See, there's no spiritual alertness in the people that are supposed to be the spiritual teachers. Mm-hmm. And they have no spirituality at all. The bulk of them. We know there were a few.
2,000 years later,
Nicodemus.
it's still going on.
Well, human nature is the same.
Yeah.
From the beginning till now, it hadn't changed. Right? Now, get a load of this. They spat in his face. Right? So Jesus being condemned to death for telling the truth. They spit in his face. They beat him with their fists. Others slapped him. We know from Mark that at some point he was blindfolded, and now they're saying, prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is the one who hit you? And Jesus did not counter. I mean, he could have counterpunched with a pretty big shot if he wanted to, couldn't he?
But he went there to do that.
That's what he's there for. That's exactly right.
And so if he had rebuffed them and got their attention and finally explained to them who he was, then that would have defeated what he was there to do.
Yeah, he had that battle the night before in the garden. He won that battle then. So going through this now, physically, is torment, right? But he's already been through the spiritual torment. He's already won that battle. So he's able to, shall we say, in the vernacular, keep his cool. Right? I wouldn't have been.
I don't think anyone else could have.
I think I just blinded him. He could just say with a simple thought or a simple word, he could have blinded them all. But Jesus held up, as we were just talking about, through all of this, right? He came there for a purpose. He's accomplishing the purpose, right? And under all this persecution, he held up. Because what was he doing the night before in prayer? Right? He was prayerfully ready now for this incident. What about the disciples?
Well, they weren't ready.
Still asleep.
They still didn't.
Now we have to give Peter and John some credit. The rest of them, they followed at a distance and ended up in the courtyard, right, of Caiaphas. And that's where we have the next incident. Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard with a certain servant girl who came to him and said, you too were with the Galilean. Now, I think it's in Mark where we find out this servant girl is the gatekeeper. So she opened the door. So she had seen him go in and out, with John. So you too were with Jesus, the Galilean. But he denied it before them all, saying, I do not know what you're talking about. First denial. When he had gone out to the gateway, another servant girl saw him and said to those who were there, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." Now, what did they think of Nazareth? First,
They don't like it.
no, nothing good could come from Nazareth. I mean, first off, nothing good comes from Galilee, let alone Nazareth. Right? And the Messiah came from where? Where was the Messiah to be born? Bethlehem, right? So nobody had done any research to find out. There were no investigative, just like there's hardly any investigative reporters today, right? Nobody's actually looking at facts. Everybody's just spewing opinion, right? And so they're saying in this derogatory way that this man is, you were with that Jesus of Nazareth. Now, who is she? A servant girl. What status does she have? None. It doesn't matter what she says. She can't even testify in court. She's a woman and a servant. She's like the lowest of the low. Now, let's presume that other people around could hear. And he was more afraid of them than he was of her. We'll give him a little bit of benefit of the doubt, right? And he denied it again with an oath. In God's name, I do not know the man. And about an hour later, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Surely you too are one of them, for the way you talk gives you away." Galileans had an accent, like Southerners. Y'all. Right? And he began to curse and swear, "I do not know the man." The cursing. Oh, by the way, the third accuser is a relative of Malchus, who had his ear removed. Malchus at some point may have pointed Peter out. That dude's the one who cut my ear off. I had Jesus in there, put it back on. All right? Do you think his relative believed that story? But he probably believed the part that dude was with Jesus. He's the one who cut my ear, right? And when you say to curse in the Greek, what it means is to ask God to send you to eternal punishment if you're lying. Was he lying? That's kind of a big step, isn't it? To convince a nobody that you're not lying.
Well, he was caught up in everything and just, I'm sure.
He showed his weakness because he was not spiritually ready for this battle, because he had spent no time praying. Right? When Jesus warned him, pray that you do not enter temptation. He said, well, I'll get around to that after I get my nap. I cannot begin to tell you how many times I've done something similar to that. So it's not like I'm here to condemn Peter. Like I said, I give him credit for following Jesus and even being there in the courtyard, He wanted, just like he wanted to pray, but he fell asleep. He wanted to be with Jesus. He just wasn't strong enough, because he wasn't spiritually ready for that kind of battle, that confrontation. And like you say, Jerry, he didn't really understand what was about to happen, even though it had been explained multiple times.
Well, it's hard, it would be hard for anybody to really believed what they were hearing.
Well, in their whole
Yeah,
life,
just-
they've been told who the Messiah was and what he was gonna do, and then Jesus comes along and does something completely different and says, oh, by the way, I am the Messiah. And now this is the program. And they're like, what? But then when they begin to understand, then Peter says, I'm never gonna leave you. Did he believe that at that moment?
Sure.
He did, 100%. Of course, he frequently got his mouth out in front of us, what he's actually able to do. But he believed that, right? Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. That was his statement, right? The Christ, the Son of the living God. And now he's saying, I don't know that dude. Have we fallen on our face like that before?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't really like to be reminded of it.
I understand that, Sheriff. Like I say, I'm in that same boat. I have those same weaknesses and problems, and all of us do. But what do we have is a Savior, right, who forgives us. And like Jesus told him at that time, the spirit is willing, the flesh is weak.
But once in a while, something happens and you just snap. You just can't. And then, if something were to happen and take you away, you're toast. And that's, I don't like to think about that.
Well, all your sins are forgiven, past, present, and future. Jesus took care of them on the cross. It's not like the Church of Christ that believe you can lose your salvation, right? Or even Methodists believe that, right? That you can lose it, you got to go get it back. Well, that's not the way it works. Jesus said, every one that God gave me, right, I have lost none. None. And who is strong enough to take them out of my Father's hand? Nobody. Not to mention, when you become a Christian, as Paul writes, you become a new creature. You've been regenerated, right? You're a new creature. You didn't have the power to make yourself a new creature. You don't have the power to undo it. Like, can you screw up? We're in the flesh. Yes, we can screw up.
I was gonna say, you can screw up bad.
You can screw up bad.
I've done it.
What'd you do?
But
What did you do?
It's what Pat tells us.
Yeah, we've all done it. We're all just like Peter, right? At some moment, where thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God, and an hour later, we're like, I don't know who that dude is. We're all like that. But God forgives us, and we can always get back to, thou art the Christ. Right? Because the devil's going to do everything he can to destroy your testimony.
yeah.
He can't mess with your salvation. So he's going to try to just get you to shut up. And unfortunately, to a lot of Christians, he's been successful at just getting us, not to testify, not to tell people about Jesus. We think we'll be embarrassed, or we think they'll slam the door, or we'll think they'll do this or that, and hardly any of that stuff ever happens, especially in the U.S., Around the world, if you're a Muslim in a Muslim country, you're likely to get persecuted no matter what. You don't even have to tell your testimony.
Yeah.
Just the simple fact that you're a Christian, you'll get persecuted. Jesus told us that. If they're going to do this to me, they're going to do it to you too. Don't be surprised. But God, in his infinite grace and wisdom, for some reason thinks I'm worthy enough to be forgiven. I have to trust his, because I don't see it. We just put our hope and our trust and our faith in Jesus Christ. And then we ride through these. But the lesson is, don't skip your prayer time. You never know when the next battle is going to be. You see, I confess I do it way too often. Anytime I'm running late and whatnot, or you make it real quick, or rather than take the time. Unlike Martin Luther, they asked him about his day, and he said, I got so much to do today, I'm going to have to pray 3 hours.
You'll have to what?
Pray 3 hours. Because after all, who's responsible for the results? God is, not you. You're there to do the effort, make the steps, right? Put in the work. He's responsible, just like testifying, right? When you testify, your job is just to tell them that Jesus loves them, died for them on the cross, right? Rose again on the third day. What happens next is totally between them and God. It has nothing to do with you. So whatever they decide to do is irrelevant to you completely. You did what God had called you to do, and that's just to testify. That's our role. By the way, it's one of the 2 things we can't do when we get to heaven. There'll be nobody to testify. Everybody there is saved. And you can't sin. We'll be done with this body, Jerry, and all that. We won't lose it anymore. Just like Peter did right here. Peter lost it. But guess what? What happened right after Peter denied Jesus the 3rd time?
You ran off and cried.
Peter remembered the word which Jesus had said, before a cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. In Luke, it also tells us that they made eye contact. Somehow, Jesus looked at Peter. That had to be excruciating. Bad enough to do it, right? And remember it. But to actually see him at that moment.
And he probably looked at him.
He did. Jesus looked at Peter. He knows what's going on. He knew Peter was going to fail, right? What else do we know about what happened to Peter after the resurrection? Jesus 3 times reaffirmed him. Take care of my sheep. He was the original leader of the group, right? Post-resurrection in Jerusalem. But then he went out and wept bitterly. I could only imagine. At this moment, he doesn't know that he can be forgiven. When I screw up, I don't necessarily run out and weep bitterly because I do know that God forgives me. He didn't know that. And his habit of running off with his thoughts in his mouth, he might be thinking, oh my gosh, I just asked God to condemn me to hell. And God knows I did this. Uh-oh. Right?
I'm sure that was no help to him at the time, but don't you think that's also an indication that he was the main man, really? I don't know if that's the best description. It didn't happen to any of those other guys.
Yeah. Well, Peter needed a certain kind of breaking. He was the wild stallion.
Yeah.
Right? And boy, he got it, didn't he? Humility, big time. and got it in a big, big dose. He realized how weak he actually was. And see, that's what we need to realize. In the flesh, how weak are we? My prayer to God most of the time is, don't leave it up to me. We know what a mess I'll make of things if you leave it up to me.
Yeah, too many times.
You know, one of the things that's really odd, though, the chief priest and all that, paid Judas 30 pieces of silver for whatever that amounts to. Judas gave it back to him,
Yeah,
because he realized he screwed up. And they couldn't use it in their dealing, they had to do something else with it.
yeah, it's blood money.
And, yeah, you know, I don't understand that. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Next week, we'll move into chapter 27. Our focal point being on verse 41 and down, which is part of the actual crucifixion, so we're skipping the rest of the trial. But we'll cover it briefly like we did this morning with the rest of the arrest and whatnot, and then get to the actual crucifixion. Any other questions or comments about what we got going on here in this lesson?
Good lesson.
Right.